The Arlington Heights Traction Company announced a plan to enlarge the pavilion and enhance the recreational facilities there. The beautiful two-story pavilion extended over the lake with twin towers in front and a domed entrance. The boathouse was beneath the pavilion with a summer theater and ballroom on the first floor. The second and third stories housed a restaurant, parlors, and other facilities. The entire building was encircled in galleries and could be enclosed for winter functions. The Black community of Arlington Heights, known as the Como community, began about 1905 or 1906. Some of the first families of Como were the Curtis Bowles, the Browns, Crooks, Tippins, Leroy's, Jesse Howard, Eva Jones, Joe Sweeney, Eugene Baker, Ben Littlefield, Claude Henderson, Etta Wilson, and Elijah White. A Bohemian family lived at 5420 Wellesley Avenue, which is the oldest house in that block. A number of white families also lived in the community. Some of the early families in the 1920s were the Bowers, the Cannons, the Crawfords, the Farrells, Hills, and Angus Wood. The gentleman on your left is Ben Littlefield, and that's Mr. Woods here on your right. Fernanda Cook, pioneer real estate dealer who sold more lots in the newly settled community of Como than anyone. He settled in Como in 1909, and during those years, he would often have to find refuge in trees early in the morning from ravening wolves that roamed the area. He said he would stay in the tree until daylight and then proceed on to his job at the packing house. Mr. Cook made it possible for many people in the Como community to own their homes. He died in the 1940s. Lake Como Dairies. Lake Como had two dairies, one off of Horn Street near Humbert Avenue, extending to the Stowe Foundry Road. An African-American family named Sebastian Crook owned the first dairy in Como. Alexander Hayes tended the cows and made hay in a cultivated area just east of Horn Street and bordering on Stowe Foundry Road. The Crooks were among the first black families in Como. The other was Wright's Dairy, operated by a white family, which early on occupied an area from Horn to what is now Bryant Irvin Road. On the east and the west, respectively, and Houghton and Camp Bowie Boulevard, defining the south and northern borders. All of this area is now developed housing and a part of the general community. Poppy Wright became very close friends with Douglas Phillips, an African-American youngster about his own age who lived across the street from the family dairy. This dairy had a mean bull that was only appreciated from the safety beyond the barbed wire fence that surrounded the pasture. This is a stock certificate. People bought stock in the Lake Como, for the Lake Como area. And I want to say A.D. Lloyd, this is his stock that he bought, and I think it was about $100 worth of stock. This is the 1908 pavilion. And you can tell that it only has like one dome, and there's the boardwalk. Here is the boathouse here, and the boats would come here and be housed up under the pavilion. The Industrial and Mechanical College. Feeling the need for a college, a group of Baptist ministers combined their ideas and started the old Industrial Mechanical College on the land that was south of Humbert Avenue in the 5300 block to the 5500 block, extending south to Helmick Avenue. A small Negro college was begun, and an all-level school for the children was held in one of the college buildings until the county built a school some years later. The leaders and prominent ministers connected with the college were Reverend L.M. Johnson, the father of Professor L.M. Johnson, retired principal of I.M. Terrell High School, Reverend Lacey K. Williams, Reverend Boone, and Reverend Scott, who lived in the community with his family. There was a balloon race off of the Lake Como. It was a man and a lady that Mademoiselle Aridad will contest with Aviator Wilson for the altitude championship of this country. 2 monster gas balloons will leave the ground at the same moment, carrying these daring astronauts in a race to the clouds. This sensational exhibition has been arranged for at great expense, but will be absolutely free to the patrons. And that was held on a Sunday afternoon after church. The one-room schoolhouse. In the fall of 1914, the few families that lived in the Lake Como community felt an urgent need for a school. As a result, a teacher was employed. Miss Lucinda Baker taught for 2 years in a small wood-frame one-room schoolhouse. The first school had an enrollment of 11 pupils. Miss Ruby G. Crawford Jones was one of the first students. Due to a decrease in enrollment, the school closed after 2 years. The school opened again in 1917, and Miss Tennessee Smith was the teacher. In 1918, Miss Pearl Walker Connor was called as head teacher. This was the Arlington Heights Colored School. Now, there were 2 schools. One was called Arlington Heights for the Arlington Heights community, and then the one that was in the black community was called the Arlington Heights Colored School. I point that out so when you're doing research looking for records, you'll have to look for either one, okay? Zion Baptist Church. The Zion Baptist Church was established in 1909 in the chapel of the old Industrial and Mechanical College at 5400 Humbert Avenue in the Lake Como community. The early organizers were Elijah and Ida White, Eugene Baker, Elizabeth Lewis, Fanny Sweeney, Leola Sweeney Hall, Minnie Ola Sweeney Neely, Viola Sweeney Richardson, Victor O'Brien, and about 6 children. Reverend Frank Ford, Reverend Kraft, and Reverend Redmond served as pastors for a short time. In 1927, this building was erected 1 block north of the old site at the cost of $8,000. Now, this is Zion Baptist Church here, the early church. And this, I don't know if this is the present verse, but this part of it is part of the older part of the church. Pleasant Mount Gilead Baptist Church in 1916, Reverend W.M. Bowden founded the Mount Pleasant Baptist Church on the present site of Pleasant Mount Gilead Baptist Church. In the mid-1920s, Reverend J.T. Atkinson founded New Mount Gilead in a house at 5312 Kilpatrick. When Reverend Quarles retired from Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in 1928, Reverend Atkinson was called to pastor the new combined flock. H.J. Atkinson, son of the pastor, suggested that the name of the consolidated churches be called Pleasant Mount Gilead. And this is one of the earlier buildings of Pleasant Mount Gilead. Camp Bowie. The lake's last glory days were during World War I, when the Chamberlain's acreage was chosen as the site for Camp Bowie, a military training camp built in 1917. The nearby streetcar line, railroad spurs, and the free use of the 2,000 acres were great incentives for establishing the camp on the still undeveloped real estate. The camp's hospital and maneuvering grounds were to the east of the lake, and servicemen walked over to enjoy some recreation while preparing to go to France. And this is kind of a sign or billboard telling them that the lake opened on Saturday night, October 13th, Supervision War Service Commission, big fireworks display. And it was only 10 cents and free for the soldiers. Camp Bowie. When the war was over, the newly developed property reverted to civilian use. With its telephone, electric, and sewer lines, the area was ready for residential construction, and developers began building homes, erasing any trace of Camp Bowie. This is what Camp Bowie looked like in 1927. Look at those cars. Como school history. After World War I, the community began to grow and more people moved into the community. There was even more a need for a larger and better school building. Mr. R.N. Riddles was the county superintendent at that time, and a school building with 2 rooms was built on the southeast corner of, now how do you pronounce this? Do you pronounce it Farron or Farron?
Farron.
Okay, street. Okay. And Bonnell Avenue, at 5535 Bonnell Avenue. Mrs. Gertrude Wilkerson Starnes was the head teacher, and Mrs. Geneva Carrington was her assistant. Later, Mrs. Jessie Raleigh and Mrs. Ruth A. Greenwood joined the staff. Mrs. M.L. Patterson came to the school as a teacher in 1931. Now, in doing my research and stuff, a lot of times, when you're looking at some of the early records, you'll find that the ladies will be named, they'll have Mrs. M.L. Anderson or whatever, and it's usually the husband's name, but they just put Mrs. on there so you know who she belongs to. Men in the community helped supply coal for heating and maintain the buildings and grounds. The building was heated with coke brought from the stove foundry by a patron of the school, Mr. F.W. Eisler. Water was hauled in barrels from the college well and later from a well located on the east side of the lake. Mr. John Atkins was employed as school custodian in 1933. The community continued to grow and teachers were added. In 1922, Fort Worth began to grow due to the oil boom, and the city annexed Arlington Heights and Lake Como into the city limits. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, there were approximately 180 families living in the Lake Como community, and approximately 15 servants were living in private homes in the Arlington Heights community. In 1935, land was purchased and the school was moved to Horn Street. The school campus bordered on Horn Street on the east, Libby Street on the south, Holloran on the west, and Goodman on the north. J. Martin Jacquet was hired as school principal in 1936. He served as principal for 10 years. Then Oscar Williams succeeded him in 1946. This is what the Como campus used to look like. And as I look at this, because I've done quite a bit of research on some of the Rosenwald schools in Texas, some of these buildings have some of the features, especially the windows, of some of the Rosenwald building plans. But this is what the campus looked like then. William H. Wilburn Sr., Como Weekly. How many of you know about the Como Weekly? Let me see your hand. Oh, yes. That was the community newspaper. In 1940, William H. Wilburn Sr. and his wife Travis began publishing the neighborhood newspaper, the Como Weekly. By the way, the Fort Worth Public Library has the collection, Mr. Wilburn's collection of the Como Weekly. And I do believe they may be in the process of possibly digitizing those records. So you can do research in those records. On November 30th, 1940, more than 500 copies of the mimeographed 20-page newspaper in magazine form was distributed free by the editor and his 4-year-old son, William H. Jr. That's kind of the way our Como Weekly looked. And for those that lived in the community, you're talking about a wealth of information in regard to community history and activities and the people that lived in the community in those newspapers. I've researched for many years through those newspaper articles, and I have found many of my family members that were part of the community, whether they were in business or social events or school events. It's a very wonderful resource. World War II. After World War II, more families purchased homes in the community. There was also a GI training school located on Bonnell Avenue to train veterans skills to help them transition back into the workforce. Is the Quonset building still on Bonnell Street?
Yeah.
That metal building? Yes, that's a Quonset hut. It's been there since World War II. The Lake Como Community Center was officially opened on June 28, 1948. The center provided supervised recreation for young people, clubs for boys and girls, a health clinic, and library. Features planned included a free employment service, a kindergarten and day nursery, a boys' workshop and playground. The community center was headed by Mr. Wilburn, who was very active in the community. The center was located at 5201 Wellesley. This was a picture of the Como Community Center in 1948. The present community center, I believe they added on to that building. But the footprint of the 1948 building is still there. Okay, this is the present one. Oh, that's, okay. This one was before they built the new one. Yeah. All right, Amon G. Carter. In 1950, Amon Carter Sr. acquired 86.5 acres of the Lake Como property. Carter gave the property to the city of Fort Worth on October 29, 1951, stipulating that the land was to be developed into residential property and a Negro park. Because what happened after the war and after Chamberlain lost his properties due to the silver panic, the lake just sat there. No one was maintaining it. It became overgrown and everything. And so I believe that that was probably when Carter decided, one reason is because a lot of the domestic help that worked for the Arlington Heights homes lived in the Lake Como area. And at this particular time, we did not have access to the public parks. And so I guess he felt like maybe, we'll let the African American families have a park. But I talked to Ruth Carter Stevenson before she passed away, and I asked her, why would Mr. Carter, her father, do that? And so she told me, she said, well, Gail, she said, now I don't know if this is correct or not. She says, but there was a family that lived in Como that worked for the Carters, Frank and Mabel Priscilla. And when Ruth Carter and her family would travel sometimes, they would let their daughter stay with the Priscillas. As a matter of fact, while I was living in the community, I attended St. Veronica Catholic Church. It was the only Catholic church in the Lake Como community. It was a small church, and I believe Reverend Wendell Campbell his church is there now on that property. But as growing up in that community, it was about 6 to 8 families in the Lake Como community that were of the Catholic faith, and that's where we attended. It was a small church. It only had 2 rows of pews, maybe about 6 to 8 on each side. And our mother church was Our Mother of Mercy on the south side of Fort Worth. Well, I would see the Priscillas bringing this little girl to church with us, but it didn't dawn on me. I thought it was their daughter. And so when I asked Ruth Carter Stevenson, she said, well, Gail, she said, I don't know why Dad thought to do that about the lake. She said, but now, my daughter, Sheila, her name was Sheila Priscilla, and Sheila Carter, but I think she lived with Priscilla at one time or another. But anyway, she says, I think what happened is because the lake was so close to where the Priscillas lived and they couldn't use the park, that she probably asked her grandpa, well, why don't they have a park? Why can't they go to the lake? And she says, I'm not saying that this is gospel truth, but maybe he said, well, we'll just do something about that. So I don't really know the true story behind it, but it makes it interesting to know that they would leave her child to be taken care of while they traveled around the world, and then, she wondered why they couldn't go to the park. Okay, in giving the land to the city, Carter stated that 65 acres would be developed as a park area, with the remaining acreage to be sold as residential property. Proceeds from the sales were to go to the park board for development of the park, and Carter also assisted the city in fencing and landscaping the area to make it an attractive civic development. Today, a modern pavilion stands in place of the original pavilion. So we've had 2 pavilions before what's there now today, overlooking a 10.1 acre lake. The dam to the south is the same, but the lake is smaller and initially extended north of where it is today. Silt, low water, and trees have claimed half of the original lake. The current picnic area overlooks the original entry to the boardwalk. The pavilion on the lake is the setting for community get-togethers, like Juneteenth and July 4th, and dances and things like that. All right, there is the lake. Como Elementary School. The Como School at 4001 Little Page was built in 1950. Now, it wasn't the first Como School because I think one of the schools was on Horn Street. One of the earlier schools were on Horn Street. Como Elementary School opened in February 1954 when students transferred from the adjacent Como School at 4001 Little Page, which was where those buildings were, where I showed you earlier, where those buildings were on the campus. In 1959, the school had an administrative staff of a principal, 26 teachers, a visiting teacher, a school nurse, a secretary, a custodial staff of 5, an enrollment of 585 students. Wilbur H. Bird succeeded Mr. Williams as principal in 1967 until the school closed in 1991. So, I mean 71. Como School History. Como Junior and Senior High School was built in 1957. The African American schools here in Fort Worth had a very short life because I.M. Terrell was considered the high school for Fort Worth, Tarrant County, and the surrounding cities where African American families were. You had kids coming to I.M. Terrell from Saginaw and Mansfield and different areas around because I.M. Terrell was the only high school. It was in the mid to late 50s that the other high schools like Como, Dunbar, Kirkpatrick, and those were built. And that was probably during one of the federal government programs when those schools were built. Como High School closed in 1971 during the aftermath of integration. The Como School began with 11 pupils in a one-teacher schoolhouse, grew to 2 campuses with approximately 2,000 students. Today, Como Elementary is still in operation, and Como High School is now the Como Montessori School. And that's the Como High School I remember. First, Lake Como Day. The first Lake Como Day, complete with free barbecue, will be held Wednesday afternoon for residents in the area and guests. The barbecue will be part of an all-day 12th annual state encampment, beginning with a parade at 9 a.m. under the sponsorship of John Davis Post No. 2, Colored War Veterans of America. The parade will start on Merrick and move north to Rosedale and south on Horn to Boniel. And that was C.W. Haley was the Post founder. The barbecue with 850 pounds of meat, oh my God, to be served was held near the Como Center at 5201 Wellesley and sponsored by the Como Civic League. Mr. Hale presided at the encampment with Mrs. V.A. Davison in charge of the Ladies Auxiliary. Lake Como has a boys club. Lake Como residents have organized the Lake Como Club for boys from 8 to 17 years old. Officers elected at the organizational meeting are Knox Tucker, that's K.J. Tucker is Knox Tucker, President, W.D. Jones, Secretary, and Benny Houston, Director of General Activities. That was from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, December 1953. Urban renewal. In 1956, I.P. Anderson was president of the Fort Worth Urban League. He presented a letter on May 31st, 1956, which stated several church member groups and organizations in the Lake Como request that the Urban League discuss the possibility of Lake Como be considered of urban renewal. The community organization requested that the Urban League appeal to the mayor and other interested committees requesting Lake Como be designated a critical area. The following proposed improvements were asked to be addressed: grading, storm sewers, street pavings, all of this. This is 1956. Okay? Swimming pool. Groundbreaking for a pool at Lake Como set for Monday. This was from the Star-Telegram. 1960s, 1970s. The new fire hall located at 5937 Geddes Avenue was dedicated in 1964 to provide better fire protection in the Como and Ridgely neighborhoods. Oh, the Bluebird. How many of us know about the Bluebird? Oh, I see. That's right. As a matter of fact, we had quite a few musicians come out of the Lake Como area. Okay, during the late 1970s, blues musician Robert Ely revived a popular night spot at the corner of Horn and Wellesley. He wanted to establish a place where local musicians could learn from one another and showcase their talent. It became known as the New Bluebird Nightclub, a school for some of the region's most famous musicians, like Jimmy and Stevie Ray Vaughan, T-Bone Burnett, the Fabulous Thunderbirds, the ZZ Top. Ely co-owned the club from 1977 to 1989. Now I want to back up here for just a minute. A few months ago, a lady came to me. Now, she was born in Cairo, Egypt, but she grew up in New Jersey. And she is writing a book in regard to some of the jazz musicians and things. And basically, she was interested in Ornette Coleman, who was in this area as a musician. So we connected and shared history and things. And she thought that it was such a wonderful legacy of the different African American musicians that came out of the Lake Como area. I just wanted to share that with you. Now, this is the new Bluebird nightclub. I don't have a picture of the older one, but this is the picture of the one. Okay, in 1973, a social study was done in regard to the Como community. 80% of the businesses in Como were locally owned, this is 1973, and operated. Most of the businesses were eating establishments. 53 businesses, 14 were bars or cafes, restaurants, 9 were beauty or barber shops, and 6 were small grocery stores. Other businesses included 3 liquor stores, 2 mortuaries, and 3 music record shops. There were also furniture and salvage stores, a shoe parlor, cleaners and laundry. Oh, by the way, I'm gonna stop here. On that laundromat that's there on Horn and Bonnell, do you know that was the first laundromat of its kind in the United States? I did some research on that. I haven't done the research on who actually owned it, but I did find information that that one was the first of its kind in Fort Worth. I mean, not just Fort Worth, but in the United States. It was the first set up in Fort Worth.
What made it so special?
I think it was because, you know, remember the laundromats where you go in and put your clothes in the washing machine and stuff? And I think that was the reason. A lot of people didn't have the automatic washing machines. They still had the ones that, that you turn. As a matter of fact, I got a neighbor in my neighborhood that still washes and hangs her clothes. Yes. There was one professional dentist living in the community. There was a very small number of businesses that brought revenue into the community from outside of the community. These included 1 contractor, 2 landscaping services, 1 beauty and barber supply house, and a local newspaper which managed to survive on outside advertising. Conclusion. The Lake Como community has come a long way since the development of the lake and its early community. The community has weathered the Great Depression, World War II, Civil Rights era, integration, environmental impact and restoration of the lake, economic highs and lows of a struggling and transitioning community, and through it all, there is a close-knit, strong, and enduring love for the community as there were in the 1900s. And I believe that. Thank you.